Christ is revealed in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 14, verses 7 through 14. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host, and the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, "Give this person your place." And when then in disgrace you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, "Friend, move up higher." Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He also said to the one who had invited him, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, don't invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors in case they may invite you in return, and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of righteousness." Last year, I led a Bible study for the middle school boys at my church. I called it Manners. And for those of you who've ever spent much time with middle school boys, or ever been a middle school boy for that matter, well, most of them definitely have a thing about wanting to be manly, but they're pretty far from being mannerly. The learning goal during those few weeks of Bible study was to take practical manners that we hope the boys would learn, like opening doors for elderly church members, using a napkin when they eat instead of their shirts, and not texting during worship. Well, probably a lot of us adults still need to learn that one about not texting during worship. But anyway, more of our manners included how to set a table, making people feel welcome in your home, how to be a guest in someone else's home, and to please use your napkin and chew with your mouth closed. We paired these everyday manners with biblical ideas of respect, community, and hospitality. Manners alone wouldn't magically transform these boys into men. Good manners are merely a sign of a deeper sense of respect and care for others. This idea of our outward signs revealing our inner self is present in the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus talks about the signs of Jewish piety, almsgiving, prayer, fundamental aspects of a practiced faith. Unfortunately, these aspects were being abused. Instead of being part of a practiced faith, these aspects became the only part of their faith, a faith that hoped for approval from humans instead of God. As I developed the plans for our Manners Bible study, I realized that so many of our manners, our relationships, and fulfillment of our deepest needs come into focus around a table, around a shared meal. And from stories offering strangers protection and nourishment in one's home, to the early church's first communion, to our everyday family dinners today, the table lies at the center of our human experience. Across families and cultures, gathering together is important. People gather to share bread or wine or falafel or manna, or milkshakes, or burgers. Cultures are defined by their food offerings. Special, sacred, and even casual occasions are marked by meals. All over the world, men and women gather together at tables, altars, mats, tents, and cushions to break bread together. And Jesus is no different. Stories, parables, metaphors, and miracles are centered around tables, food and nourishment for the body as well as the soul. Luke 14 contains two parables about feasting. The scene opens with Jesus at an actual dinner party. Verses 7 through 11 read much like a piece of social advice. Want to avoid embarrassment at a dinner? Here's what you do. Don't sit at the head of the table, because the host could have and probably invited someone more important than you. And then they'll ask you to move to a different seat. And then you'll be embarrassed and you'll have to go to the place of least importance. So it's just better for everybody if you start off sitting at the lowest seat, so then you might end up being honored instead of embarrassed in front of everybody. Definitely sounds like a good piece of advice for handling ourselves in social settings. But if we really look at Jesus' life, he wasn't exactly Miss Manners. And this bit of advice wasn't exactly solicited by his dinner company. Theologian Robert Tannehill reminds us that this discourse is introduced as a parable, so we know that right away it's going to have a deeper meaning beyond mere manners, because parables do carry meanings deeper than just a plot and a storyline. As the rich layers of this passage begin to unfold, what begins as a dinner conversation turns out to be Jesus calling out his dinner company for jostling for God's favor. In other words, those who try too hard to get to the head of the table probably going to be asked to move to a different seat. Jesus' dinner companions are exactly the sort of people eager to push themselves forward, showing how well they're keeping the law and practicing purity, the same type of people who pray publicly and clang their coins into the coffer. They jostled for the favored position, hoping that power or at least recognition would come out of their piety. From dinner party guest lists to church offerings, even down to prayer, these individuals practiced piety simply for the sake of recognition. Seeking the best worded prayers, the most eloquent sermons, the favor of their teachers, the recognition of religious denominations, the notice of their peers, all the while frowning down upon anyone who showed any sign that they did not belong at God's table. These pious people frowned upon any kind of irregularity, even actions that would make sense in principle, like healing on the Sabbath, conversing with the unclean, being friendly to a mentally ill person, sacrificing money or time until others say you are crazy for caring, and reaching out to people who believe differently. For this audience, for our audience, it is all too easy for the comfortable, legally and theologically trained to think that we are superior in God's sight to the poor, to those who lack the same opportunities as us, to those who aren't like us. But in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus tells us how to turn things upside down. Then he goes on and does it, associating with the wrong kind of people, touching the untouchables and conversing with the nobodies, healing on the Sabbath and gathering around the table with the outcasts. In his words and in his life, Jesus shows us what it really looks like to include all at our tables. In other words, it might be honorable to give charity to the poor or talk about caring for the least of these, but it is quite another thing to invite those same poor into our homes. What wise words for all of us who consider our ministerial careers to be our reservation for the best seat in the house. When are we going to learn? Jostling for the head spot is not going to gain favor with God. Extending our hands, but not our hearts and our homes, isn't going to gain favor either. Not only are we supposed to give up our seat of honor at the head of the table, we're asked to actually invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind to join us at that table. The marginalized, the poor in spirit as well as the poor in body. Those who cannot walk without leaning on others, the meek, the mourning, the merciful, the persecuted, the peacemakers. Those who hunger and thirst for bread, for wine, and for righteousness. Those who may be blind to the beauty of the world and even the gospel. The type of table in which all are welcome, social structures are dismissed, is the kind of sacred table in which God meets God's people. In the gospel world, Jesus' words would be a slap in the face to the law, the strict practiced piety of the day. And really, should be a slap in the face for us today too. We assume that we deserve to be favored by God. Because of our struggles, our talents, our sacrifices, our callings, we think that we deserve God's favor. And when we think that, we're in essence saying that we don't need God's grace. We're also implying that those that do not have God's favor don't deserve it and shouldn't be invited to the table. In truth, it seems like our tables are too often closed, reserved for our own versions of the elite. The banquet spread becomes a place of practiced piety instead of an invitation to the sacred. During our lifetime, we gather around the intimate spaces of the table with our family and our friends. Tables where our eyes are opened and relationships are formed. Our special occasions like birthdays, graduations, Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving, first dates, and funerals are all marked by shared meals. Even in the everyday, we join our families and friends across the table to satisfy our hunger and relieve our thirst. It's at the table where we share our secrets, unload our daily struggles, laugh and cry. It's at the table where all should be welcome, be vulnerable, be accepted, be extended grace, and be nourished. For it is here at the table that God meets God's people. In our churches, we often mark our special occasions by gathering as a family at the communion table. Yet, how many of our church families really include the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame? And how many of our homes do we invite the dirty, the sick, the different, and the other? And honestly, how many of us even know more than one or two poor, crippled, lame, or blind people? And how many of us romanticize those stories of the one or two crippled, lame, blind people that we have in our lives and think our relationships with those people gain us an easy spot at the head of the table of God's favor? Shame on us for offering only to those who have no hunger or thirst, while there are those who are desperate for nourishment. Years ago, I befriended a young girl named Grace. She was only 18, but she was one of the brightest, sweetest young women I had ever met. Unfortunately, Grace had a difficult childhood. Her father introduced her to cocaine when she was only 12.
Oh, wow.
She dropped out of school in 9th grade. She was moving from one family member to another, trying to escape from drug dealers and gangs. She had been in and out of treatment facilities only to return to a family that perpetuated her drug abuse. Me, as a young youth minister and hopeful social services worker, I became obsessed with helping her. I picked her up in the worst parts of town after her binges. I let her sleep in my dorm room, lectured her on what she was doing to her body, read her scripture, took her to church, and I was really proud of myself for everything I was doing for her. I thought I was doing God's work as I cooked meals for her as she recovered from days without eating, but really, I never sat down at the table to break bread with her. I was willing to help her, but only on my terms. It felt good to rescue her, and I was sure that I was doing kingdom work. But truly, who was I doing this for? For Christ? For Grace? Or for myself? One day, after a disappearance of several weeks, Grace knocked on my door. She came to tell me that she was pregnant by her 40-year-old drug dealer boyfriend and she was considering having an abortion. Her family felt as though this was best because she had been using throughout the several weeks of her pregnancy. She did not plan on quitting anytime soon. I tried everything I knew to keep her from going through with the abortion. I sent her flowers, contacted Christian crisis pregnancy centers, wrote her notes, read her scripture, lectured her on the dangers of the procedure, even gave her details about the development of her unborn child, just trying to instill some kind of guilt into her already shamed self. On the night before the abortion, she sat in my car, crying until dawn, struggling to make one of the hardest decisions of her life. The demons she had collected during her 18 years were taunting her in full force. She was so desperate for someone to welcome her to the table, to hold out their arms to her and her unborn child, to invite her to dine, to embrace her right there where she was, pregnant, addicted, hungry, and thirsty for even a morsel of mercy. But all I had to offer was a pitiful gathering of piety and morality. She didn't want to hear of right and wrong. She needed to be invited to the table. She didn't need my human opinions. She needed to be embraced by the divine. I thought I could save her, but since when do we save anyone? Shame on me for holding what I thought were her sins against her. Shame on me for thinking that I was too pious. I couldn't meet her where she was because I was so caught up in where I thought she should be. Shame on me for not inviting her to the table. If we want to be the world changers that we believe God has called us to be, then we have to make sure that our tables are big enough to include the least of these. And not just one or two token downtrodden, but truly big enough to welcome all. And not just on our terms, but on the terms that Christ shows us. The terms that keep us from taking the seat of honor and teach us to throw out our guest list. It is these terms that Jesus describes in Luke 14. It is these terms that Jesus teaches us in the Sermon on the Mount. It's not about piety or recognition. It's not about banquet seats or alms or prayers. It's about living a life of purity where we free ourselves from our worldly hopes of recognition and open our hearts and our tables to God's people, all of God's people. It's about searching our hearts for our motives and recognizing that pious displays may help us glean elite guest lists, but they're a far cry from meeting God's will. Okay, so when we set our tables, we may not know whether the fork goes on the right or the left side of the plate, but what matters is who is sitting on our right and our left. We need to practice authentic faith, a faith that displays Christ's motivations behind our movements, a faith in which all are included, the table of God for the people of God.